Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Friday everybody. Let's begin with some fiscal related developments. Yesterday, Thursday, the Ministry of Finance, in an online statement, vowed to expand fiscal spending appropriately in 2023 while optimizing policy tools including fiscal deficits and special debt to support China's strategic development. We remember over the weekend, former Finance Minister Lou Jiwei expressed that China needs to set a budget deficit target at around 3% of gross domestic product next year in order to ensure economic stabilization even after 3 years of record deficits and high levels of debt. The Ministry of Finance statement expressed, quote, "In 2023, a proactive fiscal policy should be strengthened to improve its effectiveness and play a more direct and effective role," end quote, adding that tax support will be either extended or optimized next year to provide more relief to companies. This will certainly be a hit to government coffers. It is quite safe now for us to anticipate another year of deep government deficits in 2023, and after 4 years of the fiscal drug, it may be quite difficult for governments, local and central, to kick the habit in the second half of the decade. Economists from the school of thought which postulates that China needs to rebalance the economy from the local government to households will be hoping that local governments turn to selling assets to deal with the debt and deficit issues. However, this is politically difficult, and it's too early to say whether there will be any appetite for any such moves. Anyway, returning to the here and now, many local governments have already signalled an intention to issue more special purpose government bonds. We remember that special purpose bonds are extra budgetary debt financing tools used by local governments to invest in infrastructure, utilities, energy, and other public welfare projects. Technically, a business case showing that special purpose bonds will be serviced through the revenue earned from the projects invested in is required. However, as we have discussed in previous videos, in recent years these business cases have come under scrutiny as being overly generous in assumptions and often self-serving. Ultimately, if debt is used to finance unproductive projects, then the debt servicing capacity of the economy as a whole does not increase, and the debt becomes dead weight to be paid back in the future. Chinese financial media outlet Yicai writes yesterday that over 10 Chinese provincial and municipal governments have already announced plans to release more than 600 billion yuan, $86.1 billion worth of local government special bonds, which are made up of new and refinancing special bonds in Q1 of 2023, according to timetables released by these governments. In the past, the Finance Ministry would allocate the quota of special purpose bonds every March after being approved by the National People's Congress. However, since 2018, fiscal discipline has slipped, and the Congress has been approving up to 60% of the following year's quota ahead of time. Yicai quotes industry experts as saying that local governments' newly issued debt in the first quarter of 2023 will likely exceed 1 trillion yuan. $143 billion. And it is clear that the decision to use the bonds is driven by the political goal of stabilizing economic conditions. Quote, "Local governments will start issuing their 2023 bond quota early in order to put the funds raised to use in major projects as soon as possible. This will greatly help stabilize next year's economic growth." End quote. The stimulus policies of tax cuts and infrastructure investment, which, as we have seen, Beijing has concluded will be required in 2023, demand deficit and debt-related support. Quote, "China is not only facing declining external demand and a peak in COVID-19 cases next quarter, it is also encountering a high baseline from last year's first quarter. Therefore, effecting financial support in the first 3 months will not only help spur economic data, but more importantly, it will boost market confidence." End quote. The central government introduced the Special Bonds Financing Scheme back in 2015. In that year, nearly 100 billion yuan, $14.4 billion was issued, but this amount has exploded by many dozens of times in subsequent years. In 2020, special bonds topped 3 trillion RMB for the first time. As of this week, 4.7 trillion yuan of special purpose bonds have been issued by local governments in 2022. This is about $680 billion. And again, we remember this is on top of regular spending, which itself is already in deficit. Thus, what started as a small extra budgetary fiscal tool to stabilize economic growth during periods of downturn has grown into a massive debt-fueled regime. To reiterate the previously mentioned metaphor, once this drug has been used for some years, it's very difficult for governments anywhere to kick the habit. Next up, coal power expands and Hong Kong exports plunge. Hey guys, it's just me who makes China Update every day. If you're enjoying the episode and you'd love to support it, hitting that like button and subscribing are huge helps for the channel. Anyone who can go that extra mile and help keep the channel subscribers supported, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Okay, next up, this week the Institute of Energy at Peking University, arguably China's best university, or second best after Tsinghua University, though Peking University is my alma mater, so I'm somewhat biased, published its study on China's power industry transition. From an environmental point of view, the findings of the report are not especially promising. According to the report, China approved more than 3 times as much new coal-fired power generating capacity in the first 11 months of this year as during all of 2021 combined. More than 65 million kilowatts of coal-fired electric generating capacity, compared with 21.36 million kilowatts in 2021. This shouldn't be too surprising. We remember energy security has become a top political task and priority since the winter of 2021, when China saw power shortages. In the summer of this year too, large parts of the south, especially in Sichuan, Chongqing, and Hunan, saw devastating power shortages, due in large part to the effects of drought on hydropower generation. Indeed, Wu Di, an energy analyst at the Institute of Energy, speaking to domestic media this week, expressed, quote, "Hunan showed the strongest momentum to add coal-fired power projects in China due to its tight supply of energy," end quote. Zhang Wujun, a senior researcher at the Hunan Energy Planning Research Center, speaking to Chinese financial media outlet Caixin, said the province relies on imported electricity for 80% of its power consumption, higher than most Chinese provinces. Between 2021 and 2025, Hunan plans to add between 6 million and 8 million kilowatts of additional coal-fired capacity. Europe's power crisis this year has no doubt also reinforced, in the minds of Beijing leadership, the risks of reliance on imported oil and gas. Of course, when push comes to shove, sovereign nations will normally put energy security over climate change policy, and indeed, this rapid expansion of coal power generation does undermine China's goals for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. Global policymakers should be aware that Beijing will likely continue expanding coal power generation in the medium term. The previously mentioned Wu Di, the analyst at the Institute of Energy, expressed that the institute doesn't anticipate the quickened pace of coal-powered expansion in several provinces to slow until 2030 at the earliest. China already has the world's largest coal-fired power generating capacity. As of the end of November, China's installed capacity of coal-fired power plants reached 1.12 billion kilowatts, accounting for 44% of national electricity capacity, and accounting for 40% of China's emissions of carbon dioxide. Okay, and finally for today's episode, Hong Kong, the once great thriving international city of Asia, has had a rough few years, both politically and economically, and things are still looking quite disappointing as we end 2022. On Thursday, yesterday, the Special Administrative Region's Census and Statistics Department published new data which showed that in November, Hong Kong's exports plummeted by the most in nearly 7 decades, smashed by the dual hit to Chinese and global demand. Exports crashed 24.1% last month year-on-year, the worst decline since 1954. Down from the year-on-year 10.4% decline in October. Bloomberg's Hong Kong team writes today that the collapse is, quote, far more severe than the median estimate of 16.2% decline in a Bloomberg survey of economists, end quote. Imports were down 20.3% in November year-on-year, the biggest drop since the global financial crisis, and also worse than the Bloomberg survey of economists' median estimate of a 13.8% decline. The Bloomberg analysts point out that exports to mainland China, the US, and other economies, including Japan, Taiwan, and Vietnam, all dropped by double-digit percentages. The decline in shipments to China was 29.7%, far worse than October's drop of 12.9%. Exports to the US plunged 26.8%. Quote, Hong Kong's economy has struggled throughout 2022 under the weight of pandemic controls, a global demand slowdown, and economic turmoil in China, which spent much of the year in COVID isolation. gross domestic product in Hong Kong is expected to contract for the third time in 4 years. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. I will see you all tomorrow.